example, has similar characteristics. One that allows anyone to create an application and launch it from the edge, the internet. And before the internet, we had many other networks that were closed, like the telephone network, and the TV networks, and the fax system, and the telex system. And on all of those networks, you couldn't connect unless you were trusted. And once we had the internet, we had open innovation. Innovation at the edge. Innovation without permission. And it changed the world. That is what changed the world on the internet, is the ability for anyone to write an application, launch it on the internet, and immediately have a global audience of billions. And with Bitcoin, we're now doing this to money. So when I started this, I talked about Bitcoin being money for the internet. And it is money for the internet. It's probably the most perfect money for the internet we've ever created. But it's so much more. At a very basic level, Bitcoin is the internet of money. Cryptocurrency, blockchain-based solutions will form fundamental network infrastructure that billions of people will be able to use to build transactions, to create trusted contracts with each other, and to do commerce on a global basis without the involvement of governments, without the involvement of regulators, and most importantly, without the involvement of banks. So that's why Bitcoin is important. As of 2008, when this invention was created by Satoshi Nakamoto, the banking system as we know it changed. They just don't know it yet. Credit cards died. They just don't know it yet. The wire transfer networks died. They just don't know it yet. Because I have no idea what's going to happen to Bitcoin. And I don't know where the price will go. And I do not know if another coin will emerge that's better. But I can tell you one thing for sure. A decade from now, cryptocurrencies will be part of our financial future. There is no question in my mind. The system of proof-of-work-based distributed asset ledgers, the invention that Satoshi Nakamoto gave us, that fundamental concept, which can be replicated, can be copied, can be used to build 1,000 other systems, that will be with us. Because it works, and it's useful, and it's unstoppable. So I'd like to use the rest of the time of my presentation here, and do some questions and answers. So anybody who has a question, raise your hand, speak loudly. I'll try to repeat the question through the microphone. Oh, we have a microphone. Excellent.
During the last couple of months, we've seen warning from central banks with no local applications. They just issue some warnings that we don't recommend using Bitcoins without any legal action beyond this. Do you have any thoughts what this mean?
Change is scary, especially if you've spent your entire life in systems that are hierarchical and provide certainty through authority and structure. The idea of a ragtag group of nerdy programmers creating their own currency that gives you trust through distributed computation, whatever the hell that means, I don't know, is a really scary thought. And it's very difficult to understand how you can possibly trust such a thing until you understand the math behind it. So I'm not surprised that regulators and banks and governments are reacting in ways that are sometimes a bit knee-jerk. I am amused when banks warn not to use Bitcoin. It reminds me of the idea of Tower Records warning people that MP3s are dangerous. When banks warn users not to trust Bitcoin, users who don't trust banks decide to give it a second look. And this happens with governments too. In this country, if the government says don't do something, most people listen. In most countries, when the government says don't do something, most people go, huh, that might be interesting. Because there's fundamental distrust in government, because a lot of governments are far more corrupt and oppressive than this one, right? So I think regulators are, at the moment, trying to figure out what on earth to do with this. And the reason is pretty much the same with other disruptive technologies that came before, which is, if you have a set of tools, whether these are anti-money laundering regulations, or wire transfer controls, or fraud prevention statistics, or credit reporting, or identity management systems. And those are the tools with which you've been achieving trust compliance, law enforcement, credit worthiness, and currency strength. And suddenly this new thing comes along and none of these tools apply, you think you've lost currency worthiness, trust, law enforcement, compliance, but you haven't really. People sometimes say Bitcoin isn't regulated. That's absolutely ridiculous. Bitcoin is extremely regulated. Bitcoin is regulated by several intertwined algorithms that are self-tuning. Bitcoin is regulated by math. And Bitcoin's regulation is far more predictable and deterministic than any human-based regulation. And that's why not only can you trust Bitcoin or any of the other cryptocurrencies, but you can also dismiss this idea that suddenly we will go out into the world without any of the protections of the past and the world will end. They said the same things about the internet. A lot of people had a very hard time with the idea that anyone could publish their opinion without editors, without editorial boards, without newspapers checking who gets published. The world seems like a better place to me. I like the idea of an Egyptian blogger having the same power as CNN. And I'm going to like it even more when an Egyptian blogger has the same power as Wells Fargo. So regulators are going to resist, but most politicians and most regulators understand that cryptocurrencies represent an island of jobs, innovation, growth, and votes in the middle of a sea of stagnation. And they do not want to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. Because for a politician, it's much safer to say, wait and see, let's start a committee, let's start 3 committees, let's start a committee that decides which committees we start. Then go out and make some pronouncement that alienates the entire youth vote and destroys a new technology, so only for it to take off in Berlin, or Bratislava, or Shanghai, or Cyprus, or wherever. This is a global technology. It's out of the bag. And there is no single government that can stop it right now. So I'm not worried. I think optimism will prevail. I think in the end, government institutions will adapt. Banks will adapt. They'll adapt to a less controlling, less leveraged, less powerful model, less profitable model, but they will adapt. Just like telecommunications companies that once had the ability to charge $2 a minute for a long distance call. And we took that away from them with the internet. They adapted. They didn't go away. They just produced different services to sell instead. So I'm not worried. Let's take another question. All right, front row here. Go ahead.
How does it affect money markets?
1 second, let me get your microphone.
I'm curious how this would affect lending markets.
How does this affect lending markets? That's a great question. See, people are so focused on the currency that they're only seeing the tip of the wave. They can see that this currency is affecting central banking because monetary issuance is now outnumbered. They can also see that this is going to affect peer-to-peer payments. So Wells Fargo, Western Union, PayPal, Visa, MasterCard, they're probably going to get disrupted. They're going to get hit by the first wave. But that's the little wave. The big wave is when a person who's trying to stock the inventory of their shop in Kenya can raise a loan from 10,000 people from around the world, each putting in 10 cents. A loan that doesn't require creditworthiness because the amount is so tiny that the risk is negligible. And suddenly you empower this entire new model of crowd lending that we've only seen on a tiny level today with things like Lending Club and Kiva. But you could turn that into a completely decentralized organization that would create lending for the world, by the world, and direct investment by people in people. That is a hugely revolutionary idea. So the way I look at the roadmap of Bitcoin, central banking, check. Replace that with 100 lines of Python. Peer-to-peer payments, working on it. Some payment protocols, some transactions, speed, some those security things that need to be worked out. Make it easy for everybody to do a quick transaction in a cafe. I think by the end of 2014, check. Peer-to-peer lending is the next one. And I think it's going to come on the heels of remittances. Because one of the things about peer-to-peer payment that's really going to take off is not us buying a Starbucks coffee. It's someone being able to send $150 from here to Jordan or from here to Bangalore and not pay 40% to Western Union for that. So that level of peer-to-peer payments is going to be much more powerful. And then right on the back of that, you have peer-to-peer lending. And as soon as we've checked the box on peer-to-peer lending, we go to peer-to-peer fund sourcing. And we disrupt every single stock exchange on the world by creating a global distributed stock exchange where any company can go IPO in Bitcoin and get 100,000 shareholders in Bitcoin without asking anyone's permission. And that will disrupt the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ and the London Stock Exchange and pretty much every other centralized solution for doing that. The key to realize here is that what we're doing is not inventing applications. This is just taking the existing financial services and re-envisioning them as decentralized applications. The real potential of Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies comes when you start inventing completely new services. Think about it this way. The first 10 years of the internet, it was all email. We were replacing the post office, slowly. Okay? But email had been done before. You know, people were familiar with the idea of writing and sending a letter. No one was ready for Facebook. No one was ready for digital music. No one was ready for Twitter. These things have never been done before. They create completely new spaces and completely new applications. So, peer-to-peer payments, peer-to-peer lending, peer-to-peer sourcing, and then the really interesting applications start, the ones we don't have names for today, because they simply do not exist. Because they're simply impossible to do at scale without a cryptocurrency. I just get a microphone for the gentleman. I'll try to get as many questions as I can.
What happens to those systems where trust is necessary? To give an example, stock exchange, right? The reason SEC exists is because they're trying to ensure that this particular company which is going IPO is not a fraud.
Is that the reason SEC exists?
No. It's not that.
We'll ask that.
Forget SEC. Somebody exists.
There's a trusted authority that provides credit worthiness.
How do you provide that trust into a company?
Well, so here's the brilliant thing. People often confuse the idea that Bitcoin doesn't have a mandatory counterparty with the idea that Bitcoin cannot have a counterparty. Let me give you a much simpler example. Before we go to stock exchanges, let me give you a very simple example. You buy something on eBay. The person who sold you that something doesn't deliver. What do? You do an arbitration process through PayPal, and you get your transaction reversed. And in Bitcoin, you cannot reverse a transaction. Bitcoin does not have a counterparty like PayPal sitting in the middle to reverse your transaction. And people think, well, that's going to be a problem. Oh no, that's a whole new market. Because what you can do in Bitcoin is you can do a multi-signature transaction where the sender of the money injects a counterparty. Where the sender says, I'm going to create a transaction that pays Bob for his lawnmower that he's going to ship to me, but only if this escrow service approves of the transaction, and only if this transaction tracking number from UPS shows delivered. And you do a 2 out of 3 multi-signature transaction where both of those other conditions need to be met. So now I've achieved exactly the same thing with one fundamental difference. I picked the counterparty. I structured the conditions and constraints of that counterparty, and I picked it from a completely open market of counterparties. There's one other fundamental difference. The counterparty has the ability through a multi-sig signature to either authorize or decline the transaction, but they never have the Bitcoin. They can never change the amount, and they can never change the recipient. Because that's already in the transaction, and they never got the money. It's not like I gave them the money and they gave it on, as it works with PayPal. I send it directly to the recipient, but he can't execute that transaction unless he has the additional 2 signatures. So I created counterparty protections without having some of the traditional counterparty risks, and in a free market of counterparties that I chose. Do I want an escrow service that uses PayPal arbitration? I can even pick PayPal. Do I want an escrow service that uses the American Arbitration Society for arbitration? I'll use them. Do I want to use Joe's Friendly Neighborhood Buying Consortium for eBay buyers that miraculously has become the most trusted escrow service among local eBay buyers because Joe's really nice? I'll use Joe. Free market. Counterparties cannot be mandated in Bitcoin, but they can be voluntarily added. And you can add several. You can add backups. You can do all kinds of things like that. We didn't take away the ability to have a trusted counterparty. We just added the ability to choose our trusted counterparty and to constrain their actions. And that's magical.